This is part three of the presentation of the slides that were done originally on September 21st. So, continuing after looking at communism, the United States' primary objection to communism was rooted in multiple factors, notably the communist rejection of the idea of religion. Communism is originally an anti-religion, which many people didn't like, and although it wasn't in the initial tenets of communism, Lenin and Mao and Stalin all were big advocates, as are most communist governments, of the state controlling most of the economy. So there are a few private businesses. The government controls most industries and they distribute goods and services as they see fit. So in the United States, the primary opposition to that was that we have this idea of the free market. And the driving economic principle of the right, that is the right-wing belief system, is that the natural forces, economic forces of supply and demand that kind of dictate prices are like universal forces of gravity and other concepts of the universe. That they are scientific fact, and that any government regulation, any imposition that will get in the way of those things, like minimum wage or taxes or any regulations, be them safety regulations or environmental regulations or anti-discrimination regulations, that those will get in the way of the natural forces of supply and demand, and they will limit growth. And growth is the ultimate objective of a capitalist economy. It needs to keep growing because growth means more money in the economy, and theoretically would mean more business, which means more jobs, more money for people, things like that. Now, as we'll look at in the next couple of weeks, growth and more money doesn't always mean that the money is equally distributed, but growth is ultimately the goal of a capitalist economy. Now, I put the pictures of Reagan and Nixon in there because those two presidents were the probably biggest advocates of the free market policy, and they took it to a new level. Reagan cutting taxes and kind of establishing what is now the mainstream right wing, as in Republican, economic agenda, that is cutting taxes and cutting things like you see here, regulations and minimum wage and things like that, that they see as restricting forces of supply and demand. Now, historically, when we go back, the United States government started in debt. So they started with a debt because the Revolutionary War was fought by a bunch of people who expected to be paid. They expected to be paid for their service in the military. And so a lot of people after the war went back to their original jobs. And most soldiers were farmers or poor indentured servants or people whose lives were not great before the war. And they went back to them, and suddenly they're not paid. And many of them had lost friends and family or arms and legs. And they got really upset that they saw that the founders, that with people that we think of as the founding fathers, right, your Washingtons and Hamiltons and Jeffersons, as they went back to being wealthy and living it up, and they're now creating this government, and they're unable to pay the people who gave up the most. And so they do not like that. And you might remember from United States history that the original form of government, the Articles of Confederation, basically made a bunch of little governments, one in each state, but they gave no power to the central government. So the people in Georgia said, we will collect taxes from the Georgian people, but we don't see why we should give them to a central government where they'll just end up going to people in New York. We think they should stay in Georgia. So this created a problem because that central government, again, couldn't pay any of the former soldiers, many of whom started to kind of rebel. You may remember Shays' Rebellion, a rebellion led by a farmer named Daniel Shay, who led a bunch of other veterans of the Revolutionary War to basically march to Washington to demand payment from a government that couldn't pay them. And so the founding fathers needed to think of a way to keep the country as it was, right? They wanted to maintain the power structure that kept them at the top. And so they came up with a new form of government, a constitution that had a stronger central government and created a system of taxation. Again, though, it did not come up with any distinct parameters around what the economy would look like. It did, however, specify one very important commodity: slaves. Now, remember the Three-Fifths Compromise that gave Southern states a majority in Congress because it counted enslaved people as 3/5 of people. It counted property. But it also made sure to note that they did not have voting rights. And when they said that all men are created equal, of course, we mean that they were implying very specifically that it was certain white men